The bus overturned on the highway at exactly 2:14 in the afternoon, and by 2:20, 57 people lay bleeding across 3 lanes of asphalt while sirens screamed toward them from every direction, and the only person who ran toward the wreckage instead of away from it had been suspended from her job 4 days earlier for insubordination. Before we continue, if you believe in kindness and second chances, take a moment to like this video, drop a comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to Kindness Inspire, because what you're about to hear will remind you why one person's courage can change everything. Her name was Theodora Blackwood, though everyone at Ridgemont General simply called her Nurse Blackwood, a 39-year-old trauma specialist with 15 years of experience and a reputation for being difficult, at least according to the hospital's new administrator, a man named Preston Ashford Cole, who had taken over 6 months earlier and immediately begun trimming what he called inefficiencies. Theodora had never been quiet about her opinions. When Cole cut the trauma unit's night staffing by a third to save money, she said so, loudly, in a meeting with the board present. When he denied a grieving family's request to see their father one final time because visiting hours had technically ended, she overrode the policy herself and let them in. That override was the final straw. Cole suspended her for 30 days, citing insubordination and policy violations, and told her, in front of her colleagues, that the hospital would run just fine without her particular brand of rule-breaking. Theodora went home that afternoon and sat in her small kitchen in stunned silence, staring at the suspension letter on the table in front of her, feeling something she hadn't felt in years, which was uselessness. She had built her entire adult life around the trauma bay, around the specific rhythm of chaos and control that came with saving people on their worst day. Without it, she felt like a ship with no water beneath her. Her husband had passed 3 years earlier from a sudden heart attack, and nursing had become the thing that filled the silence he left behind. Now even that had been taken from her, and she spent 4 days wandering her house, reorganizing cabinets that didn't need reorganizing, drinking coffee she didn't finish, wondering what a person was supposed to do with a life that had been paused without her consent. On the 4th day, a Tuesday afternoon with clear skies and mild sunshine, Theodora drove to the grocery store on Route 9 to buy something, anything, to occupy her hands. She was 3 miles from Ridgemont General, driving past the overpass near Miller's Creek, when she saw the charter bus ahead of her swerve violently, clip the guardrail, and roll onto its side across the highway in a shower of glass and metal that seemed to happen both instantly and in unbearable slow motion. Cars slammed their brakes around her. Someone screamed. Smoke began rising from the crumpled front of the bus, and within seconds, people were pouring out of nearby vehicles, some running toward the wreck and most running away from it, unsure what to do with the horror unfolding in front of them. Theodora did not think. She grabbed the small emergency kit she kept in her trunk out of habit, the one most people would call excessive, and ran directly into the wreckage. Inside the bus, chaos reigned, passengers from a senior community center trip pinned beneath overturned seats, moaning, bleeding, some silent in ways that terrified her more than the screaming ones. She began triage immediately, the same instinct that had guided her for 15 years kicking in without hesitation, sorting the critical from the stable, calling out directions to bystanders who had gathered at the edges of the wreck too afraid to enter. She ordered a teenage boy named Desmond Whitfield to hold pressure on a woman's leg wound while she moved to the next victim. She instructed a middle-aged man in a business suit, Harold Denby, to help her drag an unconscious passenger away from a growing fuel leak near the engine. She worked with a calm precision that felt almost inhuman under the circumstances, stabilizing airways, controlling bleeding, keeping at least a dozen people alive in those first critical minutes before any official emergency responder arrived on scene. By the time paramedics reached the overturned bus 12 minutes later, Theodora had already established a working triage system spread across the highway median, using strips of clothing as tourniquets and empty water bottles from a nearby convenience store as makeshift splints. The lead paramedic on scene, a woman named Annalise Marsh, later said she had never walked into a mass casualty scene already this organized without a command team present. Theodora didn't stop working even as the professionals arrived. She simply folded herself into their efforts, calling out patient conditions in clipped clinical language, directing which victims needed immediate transport and which could wait. She worked for nearly 2 hours straight under the afternoon sun, her clothes soaked through with sweat and blood that wasn't hers, until the last ambulance pulled away and the wreckage site finally quieted into the eerie stillness that follows disaster. News of the crash spread through the region by evening, and by the next morning, Ridgemont General found itself receiving an unusual volume of the incoming trauma patients, since it was the nearest major hospital equipped to handle the surge. Doctors and nurses in the emergency department began piecing together the story from survivors themselves, patients describing a woman in plain clothes who had kept them calm, kept them breathing, kept them alive before help ever arrived. Descriptions matched. A supervisor from the trauma unit, a nurse named Corinne Ashby who had worked alongside Theodora for years, recognized the description immediately and felt her stomach drop with a mixture of pride and disbelief. Word reached hospital administrator Preston Ashford Cole by midweek, delivered almost sheepishly by his own staff, that the woman being credited with stabilizing dozens of victims from the Route 9 bus crash, the woman survivors were calling a guardian angel in local news interviews, was the same nurse he had suspended for insubordination just days earlier. Cole called an emergency meeting with the board, uncertain how to process information that directly contradicted the narrative he had built around Theodora's supposed unreliability. During that meeting, he reportedly asked the question that would later circulate throughout the hospital and eventually the wider community: who exactly had managed to keep 57 trauma victims alive and organized before professional responders ever reached the scene? The answer, delivered by his own director of emergency services, was simple and devastating in its irony: the suspended nurse. The story spread quickly beyond hospital walls once local news outlets connected the dots, running headlines about the off-duty, suspended nurse who had single-handedly organized a mass casualty response using nothing but a trunk-kept emergency kit and 15 years of instinct. Survivors and their families began arriving at Ridgemont General not to seek treatment but to personally thank the woman who had kept them breathing on the pavement. Desmond Whitfield, the teenager who had held pressure on a stranger's leg wound, brought his entire family to meet her, tears streaming down his mother's face as she embraced Theodora in the hospital lobby. Harold Denby, the businessman who had helped drag victims from the fuel leak, publicly credited her with saving his own life, since he himself had sustained a concussion and internal bleeding he hadn't even realized until hours later. Facing mounting public pressure and a level of scrutiny he had never anticipated, Cole reversed Theodora's suspension within the week, issuing a public statement praising her exceptional dedication and leadership under extraordinary circumstances, language conspicuously absent from the termination notice he'd handed her just days before. But something had shifted in Theodora during those 2 hours on the highway, something that made her question whether she wanted to return to an institution that had so easily dismissed her value the moment she challenged its convenience. She met with the hospital board directly, not asking for her old position back exactly as it was, but proposing something new: an independent trauma response training program, one that would prepare hospital staff and community volunteers alike for exactly the kind of disaster she'd faced alone that Tuesday afternoon. The board, still riding the wave of public admiration surrounding her story, approved the program almost unanimously, and Cole, aware of how precarious his own position had become, offered no objection. If this story has moved you even slightly, please take a moment to comment and let me know, because stories like Theodora's remind us that the people who challenge broken systems are often the very people those systems need most. 6 months later, Theodora stood in front of her first graduating class of community trauma responders, ordinary people, teachers and shop owners and retirees, trained under a curriculum built entirely from the lessons of that single afternoon on Route 9. She thought often about the 4 days she'd spent believing her career, her purpose, had quietly ended in a suspension letter on her kitchen table. She thought about how close she'd come to simply driving past the wreckage that day, how easily uselessness could have kept her in that kitchen instead of on that highway. But she hadn't stayed still, and 57 people had walked, or been carried, away from that wreck alive because of it. Before you go, please leave a comment with the word courage if this story reminded you that showing up, even when the world tells you not to, can change everything.